Thank you very much, YB, for that very insightful sharing. And please remain on stage as we invite Founder and Managing Director of Eco-Business, Jessica Cheam, to moderate a fireside chat with Minister Nazmi on Malaysia's anticipated climate change bill and the country's wider sustainable development journey. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you very much, Khairun. And thank you very much, YB, for your really inspiring speech. It's an honor to be on stage here with you doing this fireside chat. We've had a very, very productive day of conversations, and I think in all the strands, everyone was very excited to get you here in the hot seat so we can ask you some of the pressing questions that we have. But perhaps I can just sort of paint, a more broader context before we dive into the climate change bill. And that really is that we are at the moment really facing an unprecedented era. We are grappling with 2 wars and very high geopolitical tensions, as well as a cost of living crisis, supply chains disruptions, social inequality, and many large powers going through political transitions and elections. And I think in that context, there are many, many competing priorities for governments. And when you are elected as representatives of the people, you have to put the right priorities on the agenda, but something like climate change is a very long-term issue, although right now we're feeling the effects. So coming, a little bit closer to the Malaysia climate change bill, I think there's very high anticipation around that. And you've been on a roadshow visiting many states, and we've seen in the media some of the stories as well that have emerged on some of the concerns that the states have. Would love to hear from you, what is the sentiment on the ground, and what can we expect when this bill is tabled? What can we expect to be inside? What can we, perhaps is not going to be included, but the government will address somewhere else? And I think that would send a very strong signal to the business and policy community, not just in Malaysia, but internationally as well.
Thank you. I think when we talk about the feedback that we get, I've spoken to people who have worked on this in other countries, in other markets. And the sense that they tell me is that it's good if we can ensure that you can lock the targets for a long time ahead, so that you can sort of, to a certain extent, take out the politics from it. Obviously, it's a piece of law that any government can come in and just take it away, right? But if we can, put the objectives far ahead enough and all that, then that will give some certainty to government, some certainty to businesses as well, as we go about working or as we embark on the journey towards net zero. And the other part is for the states. I think that there is a lot of talk about the carbon markets. Not everyone understands it, but everyone's excited about it. And I think, but we do recognize, that we need to, this is an important part for us to focus on, because what Malaysia has and what a lot of other people do not have is high quality, nature-based carbon credits, right? And I think, how do we unlock the value in that sector? And that will have important positive repercussions in our policies, not beyond climate change alone. I spoke, for example, to my parents' home state, Kelantan, and they were talking about, and this was a meeting, Prime Minister was there, Menteri Besar was there, I was there, and they were talking about, they received about 2 billion ringgit for flood mitigation projects, 500 million ringgit to build a water treatment plant. So at the end of the meeting, I told them, I said, I truly understand that Kelantan cannot be left behind. I know the sentiment when we were discriminated against. But I said, you also have to know that when you cut down your forest to get 500 million ringgit worth of timber or minerals or whatever, and then it creates a worsening floods, it creates a worsening water quality, and then you come back to the federal government for more money, then it doesn't add up. So you have to have that perspective, that overall perspective. But their perspective, to a certain extent, which I totally understand, they said they have nearly 60% forest. Selangor has cut down most. Penang, Melaka has like less than 10%. forest. So they said, what do they get for them to protect their natural resources? We have the EFT, where from 60 million ringgit distributed to all the states in 2019, this year the Prime Minister increased it to 200 million ringgit. It's an enormous jump. But even then, that's seen as too little, right? So I think these are things that we have to look at if we are to talk to the states. But going back to the climate change bill, I think we are still going on the roadshow. We have met with the governments of Pulau Pinang and Perlis, and we've secured engagement sessions with Pahang, Terengganu, Johor, Sarawak, and Negeri Sembilan. So we've also had a preliminary session with the private sector and NGOs, but we're going to come back again because, as we come back with a stronger or a stronger framework, then, we'll call back the same stakeholders again. And I think I've told my ministry, once we finish this bill, I want to do what the government did many, many years back, I think 2004, with the Water Service Industry Act, where it was put for public display for 1 month at least. So, the public can comment and we can improve on that, because I think this is a bill that is too important for it to be just in the, secret corridors of power. It cannot be like that.
Yeah, that's super encouraging to hear. Thank you so much, YB. Thank you. And I think with something like that, which really has very long-term impact on future generations, you really need to engage the ground. And I just want to pick up on something you said about carbon markets, because this has been a big theme at the forum, and you have also issued a statement just today encouraging the private sector to take part in the auction that Bursa Malaysia is putting out on carbon credits. And we just had a very exciting debate before this fireside chat, in which they were debating whether carbon markets in Malaysia should be regulated or left to free market forces. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Philosophically, I'm always very cynical about any absolute free market position. But I think definitely there has to be regulation, because we've seen that there is a tendency for what they call that sham carbon credits being marketed. So as a result, you have to have credibility. And I think it's something that, the whole world is still learning from. And that's why, we are looking at, we are having Quamut auction this week, the first Malaysian carbon credits on the Bursa Carbon Exchange. But, it had the Vera certification, but we have to be able to find something that perhaps can be done faster, because Quamut took about 10 years from inception to auction. There's a very, very long time. We need to work on our standards, and I think we don't have to start from zero. We can look at what Thailand has done with TIVA, and I met with my counterpart, and we are trying to bring about with ASEAN back. We are trying to bring about a sort of ASEAN framework for the carbon market. Because if we then, have a standard that is recognized, and we come in as ASEAN, we have the scale and we are more visible. So I think, because let's face it, if it's just Malaysia or even Thailand, we can only go so far. We need that size, that scale of 670 million people of 2030, we're going to be the 4th biggest economy as ASEAN. So that is what we need to do in order for us to be noticed. So I think that is how we should approach our carbon market, that we should have credits that are our standards, but it has to be credible, it has to be of the highest standard as possible.
Yes, I think that's very well said. And in fact, Malaysia is going to take the ASEAN chair soon, and that would be, a really great initiative to see all the ASEAN countries coming together. And I think the journey for carbon credits market has been a long and storied one. Even under the Kyoto Protocol, when it was regulated under the CDM mechanism, that was very problematic, because you still had, countries giving free allocations and, basically bogus credits that made the whole market collapse. And so regulation itself also doesn't solve everything. Free market forces, as we've seen, climate change being the greatest externality, also doesn't work. So there has to be a combination of those sort of policies. So I just wanted to ask you something about something you mentioned in your speech, which was the National Decarbonization Committee. This was set up recently to include stakeholders, including state governments. Can you tell us more a little bit about this committee and its function, and what can we expect to see on the ground?
Yeah, well, basically the idea is that to bring all the stakeholders within government together. Because if we are talking about reaching net zero and working on our, what do you call that, NDC roadmap and LT-LEDs, then it's beyond NRES alone, beyond my ministry alone. We need, for example, the Ministry of Economy, because they deal with the oil and gas sectors and overall economic planning. We need Petra, because it handles energy and water. We need the local government ministry, because the development plans and waste management that they have, and so on and so forth. But it also needs the state governments, because things like our best carbon sinks, i.e. the forests, are within the control of the state governments, right? So the idea is that we can sit down together and we can see that because of our targets for 2030, for 2050, how much are we on track, and what the different ministries and the different state governments are doing for us to achieve that. That's basically the idea, because we have our Climate Action Council committee meeting, but that normally happens, and that's chaired by PM. That happens normally once a year, because there's so many other things to do, right? But when we have this, then it's slightly more focused and targeted, and we can do a lot more sort of settle the working level work before it's brought up to the Prime Minister's level. Yeah.
I see. Perhaps we can broaden that conversation now to talk about the energy transition. You mentioned that $1.2 trillion is needed for NETR's needs. And I think the energy transition piece has been a very important conversation in Malaysia's wider economic transition, and that intersects with your sustainable development agenda as well. And when we talk about the ASEAN power grid, for example, and renewable energy exports, you've done a lot of policy changes that have really spurred investments into this sector. But in the earlier part of today, we've heard that there's still many bottlenecks. Permitting is an issue. I think Aichin from OCBC said, can we have a one-stop portal where we can just go and then everything gets approved? So can we get a flavor from you? How do you think Malaysia would tackle this? Because it really is a huge commercial opportunity, but there seems to be just a few things that is needed to unlock that scaling. Well,
the short and happy answer that I can give you is that it's no longer under me, right? That's a short one. But I know, I can't wash my hands. If you ask me, I think the main challenge for our energy sector for so long has been that any of us who grew up in the 1990s will remember the various blackouts that we had, right? I was on a scout camping trip, and suddenly the whole town just, it was just, all the lights went out. And it wasn't one, it was twice at least major blackouts in the country. Those who seem puzzled, you must be very young. So I think after that, how we design our grid, at least I'm talking about the peninsula, Sabah is still facing this ongoing problem. But in the peninsula, we were designed the grid to really focus on affordability and reliability, right? That's the energy trilemma. The third part is sustainability. So there has been a reluctance from the system to tweak what we have to be more sustainable for the fear of losing the reliable aspect. Because the reliability part, we are already sort of really world class. I mean, Peninsular Malaysia. So, and we went through series of meetings. Sometimes I had 4 or 5 pre-councils just to get people to understand that we have to embark and embark on this new path, because that's what the world wants, right? And I think, I have no single share in TNB, but you can see the price of TNB shares has gone up, since government made all these announcements. But granted, a lot of things on the ground still needs to move, right? So I think Prime Minister keeps asking Cabinet, where's the TPA, where's this, where's that, right? Because he also listens to the businesses and he's raising it back. So I think this is something that it's an ongoing thing. So I don't envy DPM Fadila because he has to deal with this. But it is just basically it's a fundamental shift of mindset, right? So also because before this it was that thing of TNB basically being the sole provider of electricity. So we are shifting away from that. And even if you look at the ASEAN power grid, it's been spoken about for many, many decades. But what we have this time is one, the price is right? Because price of energy is high enough for us to do this. Two is because of sustainability. Why is Western Europe can really accommodate a lot of RE is because the grids are connected, right? So I think that those are the things that we need to really push. And I think next year, the ASEAN Power Grid is another big part of our chairmanship of ASEAN. But I think, to be fair, I think even with the NB, even with people are starting to get and understand that even with the Energy Commission. But we just have to continue putting giving a strong leadership and tell them that that's the way forward.
Thank you so much, YB. I think I'm very excited to hear that because 20 years ago when I was a journalist at the Straits Times, I was covering energy and the ASEAN Power Grid was talked about then, and I wrote a column saying perhaps we'll see it in 10 years, and it's been 20 years, and now finally I think the time is right. And I think that, coming from Singapore, we have a lot of we're an alternative energy disadvantage, but we have the investments that we want to make into our neighboring islands. I know that there's the Riau project that's coming up, there's a JB project that's also coming up, and I think that cooperation is very much needed. And perhaps also, talking a little bit about the international scene, perhaps we are going to go to COP29 in Azerbaijan, and in COP28 we also saw that the world leaders actually agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. So in this era where we are seeing so many high geopolitical tensions, but we still need international cooperation on such an issue like climate, what are your hopes and expectations for what's going to happen at the end of the year this year?
Well, last year, any of you who went to COP28, Malaysia was, well, fortunately or unfortunately, we shared the same building with China, right? So during the events, it can get a bit noisy, and yeah, I think, but anyway, I wouldn't go into detail about that.
It was very noisy.
But I think one of the things that really was quite interesting was that we caught, John Kerry going to and fro from the Chinese pavilion. Because the discussions between the two powers, right? So definitely, if you want to talk about any climate agreement, nothing will happen without some commitment from China and some commitment from the US. So I think what was interesting is that while overall geopolitical tensions are still quite high between the two countries, but last year there has been some breakthroughs with regards to climate discussions, and I think if we can continue to put that as an important perspective that regardless of the geopolitical tensions, because this is something that unites us, and say America commits to a lofty climate goal, but China does not. It doesn't work because at the end of the day, we are on one planet, right? Even a country as big as the US, right? What more? Malaysia, we're just like the Sangkanche lah. So I think we hope that sort of thing can prevail. And for Malaysia, we work. One of the things is that we also try to work with we're trying to get a stronger voice for ASEAN. There was a common position for ASEAN last year, but I think if we can put it on a higher level slightly, there will be an ASEAN pavilion in COP29. But also to see, other countries, like-minded countries. So another thing that we have to leverage on is by looking at Malaysia being one of the 17 mega diverse countries. We are a small country. The other mega diverse countries are Brazil, India, China, US, Australia. So, but Malaysia, Congo, South Africa, Brazil, we are developing countries. We are mega diverse. We should also come together and put certain common positions. And when in our communications with Brazil, and Brazil will be hosting COP next year, and PM, I think is scheduled to go to Brazil either this year or next year. So these are the things that we should build on in order for us to really cut through all these geopolitical tensions and say that, let's put all those things aside and speak about this common challenge that we are facing. And I think if we are looking at COP28, there were some positive developments. I think we can build on that.
Thank you, YB. That gives me hope that the world leaders are doing the right thing. But I think now everybody is watching the US and wondering how elections will go, because the results would have very, very significant impact on the Paris Agreement. I want to bring the delegates in now. I know you've been waiting for this moment to ask YB some questions. We have a Slido. If you can enter your questions there, I can take a few of them before we have to wrap up. But perhaps before, or as we wait for the questions to come through, YB, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the social justice angle, which you talked about earlier. I know that you're a strong champion and advocate of the just transition. And in this transition, it hasn't been easy. And in some communities, I think some vulnerable communities, for example, the Orang Asli communities across the peninsula in Borneo, Malaysia, have had some concerns about energy transition and also what's happening to their forests, and how carbon credits, for example, will trickle down to them. So what do you think are some of the top issues that you are really concerned about when it comes to social justice and the just transition?
Well, yeah, we've seen this, happening before, right? So you have people talking about carbon credits in overseas, but it just sort of flew above the local community there, the local indigenous community. So I think that is something that we must ensure it cannot happen in Malaysia when we embark on whether we want to build a new mini hydro or we want to do carbon credits or whatever. The local community must be, the principle of prior and freely informed consent, must be defended. And I think the impact of getting them involved has been significant when we look at how we have our patrolling program, our community rangers involving the Orang Asli. We have, it's one, it gives them a livelihood. Two, it also, because they know the forest and they can stay there for 2-3 weeks. They can carry heavy bags, survive there, and they fight the poachers and prevent poachers from coming in. So, and that has been very effective. We started with 1,000 community rangers, a mix of military veterans and Orang Asli. Now we have 2,000 overall, right? So I think this is something that we should really build on. So I think when we embark, we want to create carbon credits or whatever, we have to ensure that all the local communities are involved and the benefits must reach them.
Very well said, thank you. We've got quite a flood of questions coming in, and perhaps I will combine a couple of questions around the climate change bill. There's someone who said it might be too late for the climate change bill and it might not get passed. Would it be more effective for a carbon price to be imposed starting 2025 instead?
I think I disagree. Whether I'm quite confident that it will be agreed. We are reaching out, we are meeting the various state governments. What we're also doing is that we are also planning to bring it to the Parliamentary Select Committee. It's chaired by the opposition, because I think this is something that we want to do. But the other part is that we are also within the climate change bill. The framework for carbon pricing is also built in the bill, right? Because even if you want to have a pricing and whatnot, there has to be a source of how do you legislate? How do you put the pricing? So there has to be a legislation. So MOF today is discussing with World Bank on carbon tax and all that. So our idea is to have a bill that is ready for when, because it may not come next year, it may come 2 years later for the carbon tax. But once you have the bill, it can accommodate all the various carbon pricing mechanisms, because that's how the idea is. Because it's very new, right? Because even there were states that were claiming that carbon is a state matter. It's not true, okay? Because in 1957, no one in the world was talking about placing carbon in state or federal. Two is that while states have land and they have forests under their jurisdiction, we are the ones that have to report to the UNFCCC with our NDC, and the N stands for Nationally Determined Contribution, right? So that's how we look at it. Obviously, the states are very important, but we have to play that role of providing the framework and direction.
Wonderful, great to hear that. We have a question here from Surin, who says that the success of climate action is dependent on a robust and independent forest monitoring system. Would NRES take action to address this fundamental issue?
Okay, so this is where the challenge comes, because it's about forests, right? So I said just now about carbon not necessarily being under the state matter. But when it comes to the forests, we have three big forest authorities. You have the Jabatan Perhutanan Semenanjung Malaysia, you have the Sarawak Forest Corporation, and you also have the similar body in Sabah. And sometimes one of the challenges that we face is there are definitions and whatnot that can get lost in translation when you talk to these three organizations. But what we are trying to do, is trying to build a common, agreement on certain fundamental things. Common monitoring, because for us, at the end of the day, we have one of the important things that are bringing the states together is the fact that the federal government is giving out the ecological fiscal transfer. And part of the calculation is based on the amount of forest that you have, right? And that has to be audited, and that has to be, we want to check that forest is there, right? So these are the things that we are trying to improve on. Because we also know that when our palm oil plantations want to sell their products overseas, and we want to tell, for example, the EU that we are, we are truly sustainable, then we want to show all these figures, right? So, but how do we get these figures? It has to be credible. So I think that these are why we are working on creating a much more uniform and, credible system to deal with this, to look at the numbers, yeah.
Actually, you brought up a really good point, because I think Malaysia is well positioned to comply with the EUDR. But what is your view of, all the policies that are coming out of the EU around sustainability that has huge impact on Malaysia's supply chain? Do you feel that that's a bit of an overreach, or do you feel like, Malaysia corporates are very well positioned to respond to that and even, gain a competitive advantage?
I think for us, Malaysia is a trading country. We, if you want to sell to domestic market, I think a lot of companies will go bust. We are such a small economy, so we have to trade. And in order to trade, then that means we have to deal with the various requirements across the world. The challenge for us is that there are parts of, when you talk about the timber industry, there were certain rules, because timber is actually under the KPK, under the Plantations and Commodity Ministry. But there were certain rules for the timber industry that they had to comply with about 20 years back that came out from the EU. And it took a lot of investment from the government, from the companies to, to upgrade the practices and whatnot so that they fulfill the EU requirements. Then just as about to comply with that, then suddenly, EUDR comes about, and you have to comply with these new regulations. I think that is the shifting goalposting that we find that can be it's challenging, particularly for the SMEs. It also depends. When we talk to certain people in the EU, they say, don't worry, so Malaysia shouldn't be worried, you comply with everything. But then, when it goes to the European Parliament, for example, then suddenly Malaysia is being flagged up as a country that is among the worst example of something. So I think, because that's the challenge that we face, sometimes a lot of people don't even understand it, whether, sometimes even in the EU or even in Malaysia, and a lot of miscommunication happens. We would love, we do not want to condone bad practices or, just to clear our forests like what it was done in the past. We do not want to pursue that path. Right, but I think there has to be a much more open discussion, and sometimes, I'm not saying every time, but sometimes you do find that when they have certain rules, it does benefit certain countries in the EU. It helps their products at the expense of us. So I think, at the end of the day, it's a trade war, right? But it's just being waged under another name. And we find it a bit difficult to accept because you're using the environment as an excuse for you to wage a trade war.
No, those are very interesting developments, and I think there's still a space to watch because even within the EU, there's a lot of debate as to which bills get passed and which regulations get passed. I think I have time for just one final question before we wrap up, and I think that this question here, and I'm curious, I'll combine it. One is that Sabah has indicated that they're interested in building a new coal-fired power plant. What is your response to that? And perhaps, linking to that in terms of trends in Malaysia that you see, there's also a question about why is EV development, electric vehicles, not more accelerated in Malaysia?
Okay, I think going back to Sabah, as I mentioned, Sabah faces real challenges. In fact, I was there a few months back, and then suddenly I was staying at a friend's place, and then suddenly, the lights went out, and I called my friend and said, "Oh, this is a usual thing, right? It's not unusual." Particularly when it gets warmer and all that, higher usage of aircons, and they had some problems with 1 or 2 power plants. So I think, but obviously when we talk about this, I mean, our position is, we do not want to have a new coal plant because that will have a bad impact on our emissions. But we also need to suggest an alternative to Sabah. So that's the real challenge. Even when you talk about gas, less emissions, yes, although it's still fossil fuels. But then the supply of gas that Malaysia is getting, I mean, we used to be a net exporter, but as we start to close down our coal plants, we will turn into a net importer of gas, and that's a very expensive situation. So we have to look at it overall. And now Sabah, they control their own electricity regulation. It's no longer under the federal government. Sabah and Sarawak, they manage their own. But I think we have to persuade and find other ways where the federal government can look at improving. I think there is talk of, the other thing was that there was supposed to be a grid connection on the southern part of Sabah so that there's a perfect circle, so to speak, of the grid. Because now there's only one single connection between east and west. And anything happens to that, the west coast, where the bigger cities are, will just collapse. The east coast, because the lack of gas plants, will just see total blackout in the Sandakan, Sempurna side. So that's that on electricity. I think that is the challenging part where we have to convince Sabah, but I think I can understand why they are just, for them, any form of electricity, green, brown, or whatever is just, necessary. Two, on the issue...
Electric vehicles.
Oh, EV, yeah. Well, EV, there was a chicken and egg issue. I think that was the fundamental thing. I had personal experience as well when I used an EV and, we got stuck when we were traveling quite far. And the whole system at times, I think it's not so great when you had to use different apps and so on and so forth. But now Tengku Zafrul is working very hard on the EV task force. He chairs it, and there's a few other ministers, myself, Anthony Loh. We are all in that, Ngakoming, we are all in that committee. So what we are doing, we're trying to make the rules as forward-looking as possible. Because some of the regulations can be a bit restrictive, right? Two is that, the Energy Commission has also changed certain rules to make it easier to install chargers. But the other part, which is now happening, is the fact that we are getting more and more EVs coming in. In reality, the EVs can go really cheap. But MITI, I think, puts a requirement for EVs not to be, imported EVs, not to be priced below 100K. But that ruling will, I think, is the next 2 years. So by 2026, it's an open market. So now I also know Perodua and Proton is working hard to have their own EVs because they know that by 2026 they have to compete. And I think, and the next thing that will really propel the transition is RON 95 for subsidy retargeting. Right? So I think that is the the other difficult decision that the government has to do, but I think eventually that will be the main thing. Why are EVs big in China? Because they have to pay market price for petrol. Simple answer. So I think, after that, the charges and all that, it will come into place, right? The main issue is because of the cheap fuel. So you have, like I like to say, people who have a Porsche, when they bought it, they keep filling it with RON 97, and then when the fuel went up from 2 ringgit to 4 ringgit, they don't care whether it's RON 97 or RON 95, right? No matter how expensive the car. And that's the problem that you have with blanket subsidies.
Yeah, no, and I'm so encouraged to see this government actually taking bold leadership to be removing those subsidies, and we hope to see more of that. And just my final question to wrap up this really fascinating fireside chat, YB, is that we'll take it back to sustainable finance, which is the theme of this forum. And I want to give you the opportunity to ask the private sector leaders and the community here, what is your ask of them? What do you hope to see in Malaysia that will help to mobilize finance at speed, at scale, that will help your sustainable development agenda?
Well, I think my major ask is that, we are trying our best to work within the government with, like I said, the subsidy, retargeting and all those things. That is what we are trying to do to make sustainable practices be more profitable. But I think fundamentally, what we are asking is for a totally radical look at the way of doing business. We can't look at ourselves as isolated companies, isolated sectors anymore. We are really in it together. If the ice caps in the North Pole suddenly melt, right, we are all going to face an existential crisis. So how do we play our part? Because I think the most, it's the most, if you're watching a movie and that's that part where the hero or heroine doesn't do something and you just, pinch yourself, why can't they do this? We are in a situation where we can actually save the planet. We have that opportunity. But the window is closing down, right? So if we just sit down, I know there's two sides. When people are against this view, they are either denying climate change or they feel that it's too late. Right? But I think that for me, we still can save, as much of the planet as possible. I mean, if you have children, if you have families. So I think we should do something, right? Because then, by looking at the business differently, when you look at the difficult choices that you have to make, some of it will cost money to invest, then it makes it worthwhile. You understand why it's worthwhile. So, because going back to just pure business, people, the younger people, the Gen Zs, they are very discerning, right? My son, he keeps scolding me when he sees forests being cut and whatnot, right? He says, "Abah, you're a terrible minister." So the Gen Zs are very much different in their outlook. They want to buy from a company that's green. They want to work, even with slightly less salary, for a company that's green. And they can see through greenwashing. So don't just do this for the marketing part. It has to be seen beyond that. But yes, the profits are good, but you have to understand why we're doing all this.
Thank you so much, YB. I think he's given us enough homework to reflect on. And also, if I could add, it's not just saving the planet, it's saving ourselves. Humanity is on the line in terms of what the disruption would bring. And I think going back to what you said at the start of your speech, there's going to be no returns and no profits on a dead planet. So please join me to thank YB for such a fascinating and wide-ranging chat and for being such a good sport for all our questions. Thank you so much, YB.
Thank you, Jessica. Could I invite you both to remain on stage, please, for a photo?